When I speak to you today about the mother shadow, I am not speaking merely of a personal wound, but of an ancient psychic architecture, a primordial chamber within the unconscious where the earliest impressions of life were carved before you ever had a name for yourself. The mother shadow is not your mother. It is the psychic imprint, the archetypal residue left behind by the way your soul encountered her moods, her fears, her warmth, her absences. And for the INTJ and INFJ empath, this shadow becomes the first prison, because you were born with a heightened sensitivity to the emotional tides moving beneath the visible surface of the family constellation. You were born with an inner ear tuned to frequencies others cannot hear. And so you absorbed not just the spoken words, but the silences, the tensions, the unexpressed grief, the forbidden anger, the unspoken longing. It is as though you were initiated too early into a world that was not ready to reveal its truth to you. And so your psyche did the only thing it could do. It swallowed the environment whole and later mistook the indigestion for identity. When I say prison, I do not mean iron bars or visible chains. I mean something far more subtle, far more insidious. I mean the psychic atmosphere a child builds around themselves when they sense that their emotional survival depends on attuning to the needs, moods, and shadows of the mother figure. The empathic child learns quickly that love is not simply given. It must be earned through hypervigilance, through self-erasure, through an exquisite sensitivity that borders on clairvoyance. You did not learn to feel, you learned to overfeel. You did not learn to see, you learned to foresee. And so within you grew a watchtower, a sentinel spirit that never slept, never rested, never allowed the inner child to be a child. This is the first imprisonment, the burden of perpetual awareness. Many of you believe you simply became sensitive or intuitive or empathic, but this is not so. You were shaped by a psychological necessity. You adapted to survive, and the adaptation, once useful, became a shell that hardened, then thickened, then fused with your sense of self until you forgot there was ever a time before it. The INTJ or INFJ empath, though introverted and inward, is not born with a burden they inherited psychically. This is the reason why so many of you feel older than your age, heavier in your inner world than your outer life warrants, as though you have been carrying something that does not belong entirely to you. That is because you are, the mother shadow does not simply sit behind you, it weaves itself through your earliest memories, infusing your dreams with archetypal images that whisper of both belonging and exile. When people speak casually of the shadow, they speak of the repressed, the unacceptable, the dark urges you do not wish to admit, but the mother shadow is different. It is a constellation of meaning around the first object of attachment. It forms not from aggression, but from longing, not from hatred, but from unmet tenderness. It is a shadow built from the absence of what should have been present And for an empathic psyche, especially one of the intuitive judging type, this absence becomes formative, shaping their relational patterns for decades to come. Often without their awareness, they move through life instinctively, trying to heal that original fracture by healing others, by understanding others, by merging with others, as though by tending to the wounds of the world, they might finally soothe the wound that formed when they were too small to name it. I have seen this pattern not only in patients, but in dreams, where the psyche reveals its secrets with symbolic precision. There is a recurring dream among empaths. One I have encountered many times, though it wears different faces. The dreamer stands before a vast house, ancient, with too many rooms and corridors that shift like living things. They wander through it, calling for someone, a mother, a figure, a presence they cannot see. The house is both familiar and ominous, containing the warmth of home and the dread of abandonment. At some point, the dreamer finds a locked door, and behind it they hear a child crying. But the key is always missing. That child is not a stranger. It is the dreamer's earliest self, imprisoned not by cruelty, but by emotional neglect, by the psychic coldness or instability of the maternal environment. This dream is the soul's way of telling the adult what you seek from lovers, friends, mentors, the world you seek, because you once stood before a closed door inside your own psyche and could do nothing but listen to the echoes. This is why I say the mother shadow is the first prison. It is the first room of the unconscious you inhabited before you knew you had an inner world at all. And some of you never left that room, even as you build careers, relationships, families. You look outwardly, adult but inwardly, remain a guardian standing before that locked door. The empath especially is trapped by their own goodness. They have learned to confuse devotion with identity, compassion with obligation, sensitivity with destiny. And so the mother shadow becomes not simply a wound, but a myth that governs the psyche. I must carry others because I could not carry myself. I must understand others because I was not understood. I must heal others because my own healing was postponed. But I am not here to simply reveal the prison. I am here to reveal the path out, and the path always begins with recognition. For what remains unconscious controls you absolutely. When the empath begins to see that their sensitivity is not merely a gift but a survival adaptation, they awaken. When they see that their intuition was once a radar for danger, they awaken. When they see that their independence is built upon the belief that they must not burden anyone, they awaken. Awakening is not an explosion, but a soft turning inward, a realization that the very traits you pride yourself on, your emotional intelligence, your perceptiveness, your self-sacrifice, were once defenses that kept you alive in the psychological climate of childhood. The INTJ and INFJ empath often carry this shadow more intensely because their intuitive function is directed inward, toward the unconscious, like a lantern illuminating symbolic meaning beneath every gesture, every silence, every fracture in the relational field. They see deeply, but they were forced to see too early, and so their intuition fused with vigilance, their introversion fused with emotional responsibility, their empathy fused with guilt, and so the prison is built not from darkness, but from insight misapplied, from awareness that arrived before safety was provided. This is why so many of you feel both powerful and powerless at once. You hold immense psychic insight. Yet, it often serves others more than it serves your own soul. Imagine for a moment that your psyche is a vast forest. In this forest, there is a clearing where light never quite reaches, and in that clearing stands a figure, the mother shadow. She does not turn toward you. She does not speak. She is not malicious. She is incomplete. Around her swirl the unspoken emotions. She once carried her anxieties, her traumas, her disappointments, her unlived life as a child. You walked into this clearing unprepared, feeling responsible for the storm around her. And because children are narcissistic by nature, not in the pathological sense, but in the developmental sense, they believe everything that happens is because of them. So you took her storms personally. You believed her sadness was your doing, her silence, your failure, her inconsistency, your inadequacy. The mother shadow grows precisely through this misunderstanding, the child's attempt to create meaning where there was only chaos. And so the prison forms the belief that you must compensate for what was never yours to fix, the belief that your worthiness is tied to the well-being of others, the belief that love must be earned by anticipating needs, softening emotional edges, walking on psychological glass. These beliefs do not remain in childhood. They bleed into adulthood, shaping friendships, careers, romances. You find yourself drawn to the wounded because you were shaped by the wounded. You find yourself merging with the unstable because instability formed the backdrop of your first emotional language. You find yourself giving too much because giving was once the only way to feel safe. And so the prison is reinforced not by the mother but by the adult empath who unconsciously reenacts the original dynamic, hoping to rewrite the ending. But let me tell you something profound, something the unconscious whispers. To those who finally approach the locked door, the child crying behind it does not need the mother, they need you. Healing the mother shadow is not about confronting the mother figure or assigning blame. It is about retrieving the self that was left behind in order to survive. It is about walking back into the psychic house of your childhood, down the corridors that still shift, past the rooms full of memories and dreams, until you stand before the door once more. But this time, the key is in your hand, because the adult consciousness carries what the child lacked: autonomy, insight, compassion, strength, You are no longer the powerless observer. You are the mediator between the conscious and the unconscious, between what was and what can be. In the analytic process, I have seen many such transformations. They do not arrive like lightning, they arrive like dawn, slowly illuminating what had long been hidden. The empath who once felt trapped by the mother shadow begins to feel a loosening. The internalized guilt dissolves. The compulsive caregiving softens. The attraction to wounded figures weakens. The vigilance relaxes. And suddenly, they feel something they have never felt before. Interior spaciousness, a sense of groundedness that does not depend on another's mood, a sense of emotional neutrality that is not numbness, but sovereignty. This is the moment when the prison door cracks open, not because the mother figure changed, but because the empath did. Yet the journey does not stop there. The mother shadow, being archetypal, must be understood symbolically. It is not merely personal, it is collective. To face it is to face the universal truth that the feminine principle, in its wounded form, shapes entire civilizations. When the mother is chaotic, children grow watchful. When the mother is absent, children grow hungry. When the mother is overwhelmed, children grow overdeveloped in the psyche, assuming roles far beyond their age, and so healing the mother shadow within oneself echoes far beyond the personal realm. It becomes a contribution to the collective psyche. Every empath who frees themselves frees something ancient in the human soul. But to walk out of the prison, one must first understand its architecture. You must look at your empathy not as an identity but as an adaptation. You must see your intuition not as an inherited superpower but as a radar that once scanned for danger. You must see your independence not as strength but as the result of emotional self-reliance forced too early. This is not to diminish your gifts, it is to understand their origin so that you may reclaim them intentionally rather than unconsciously. And now, as I feel the emotional undercurrent of this room, I sense that many of you are beginning to recognize the contours of your own prison. You feel its walls around your chest, its echoes in your relationships, its ghostly presence in your decisions. Some of you feel as though you are hearing your own life explained for the first time. That is not my voice. This is your unconscious speaking through mine. The psyche recognizes its own symbols when they are spoken aloud. It knows when truth is present. And so I invite you to breathe, not simply as a physical act, but as an inner symbol. For breath is the bridge between consciousness and the unconscious. When you breathe deeply, you awaken the inner witness, the one who was always there, hidden behind the vigilance, the empathy, the anticipation. This inner witness is the one who will guide you out of the prison, not by force, but by illumination. The mother shadow is not an enemy, it is a map. The path out is already written in you, and we will continue walking it together. As we continue this exploration, I ask you to follow me, not with the logical mind alone, but with the deeper organ of perception that dwells in the unconscious, that instinctive knowing which recognizes truth before thought, gives it form. For the mother shadow, when truly encountered, does not reveal itself through logic, but through atmosphere, through a subtle trembling in the psyche, through the feeling that something ancient is rising from within. Many of you feel this now, a kind of inner stirring, as though the deeper layers of your being know we are approaching a place long left untouched, a place where memory blends with myth and personal history, becomes indistinguishable from archetype. The mother shadow, particularly for INTJ and INFJ empaths, often expresses itself first as a tension in relationships. You may find yourself drawn to individuals who evoke the same emotional climate you grew up, in those who are unpredictable, emotionally distant, self-absorbed, or wounded in ways you feel compelled to soothe. The empath learns early that loyalty is not simply an act, it is a spiritual duty. You instinctively step into the role of healer, interpreter, stabilizer, mediator. This role becomes so deeply ingrained that even as adults, you enter relationships not to be met, but to repair. You merge with the other person's emotional state as though their survival were tied to your vigilance. You mistake your attunement for love and your exhaustion for devotion, but this pattern reveals something crucial. The empath does not choose relationships freely. They are pulled by the gravitational field of the mother shadow. It is as though the unconscious is trying to complete an unfinished story, trying to rewrite an ancient script by choosing partners who mirror the emotional landscape of childhood. Yet these repetitions do not bring healing, they bring deeper entanglement. You suffer the same wounds in different forms, believing it is fate or bad luck, when in truth it is the psyche's attempt to resolve what has never been integrated. In analytic work, I have seen patients who described their partners as enigmas, emotional puzzles they felt destined to solve. They poured their soul into these relationships, believing that if they could unlock the other person's heart, they would finally unlock their own freedom. But this is the mother shadow in disguise. It calls you back to the original wound, whispering that healing lies in reenactment, when in reality, healing lies in withdrawal of projection. For the empath, projection is not an illusion cast onto others, it is a longing cast into them. You imbue them with the power to heal the part of you that remains locked behind the inner door. You believe they hold something essential, when in truth they only reflect your own buried longing. Let us look deeper into the symbolic nature of this prison. In many dreams of the empathic personality, the mother figure appears not as a person but as a landscape, vast oceans, turbulent trees, collapsing houses, shifting sands, empty corridors. These dreams reveal a truth. The mother shadow is not an image, but an atmosphere. It is a psychic weather pattern, a child raised under emotional storms grows into an adult who internalizes storms as normal, and so calm becomes suspicious, stability feels foreign, love that does not require effort feels unearned. This is why so many empaths prefer intensity over peace, depth over balance, longing over fulfillment. The nervous system, shaped by early unpredictability, finds its identity in the very chaos it once endured. Yet, somewhere deep within, there is a part of you that remembers a different truth. It knows that your sensitivity was not meant to be a burden. It knows that your intuition was not meant to be a defensive shield. It knows that your empathy was not meant to be a lifelong atonement. This part of you, your true self, has been waiting behind the locked door. It has been dreaming of the day when the adult you would return, not to repair the mother's wounds, but to retrieve the self that was sacrificed to them. You may think this retrieval is a simple act, but it is one of the most profound initiations of the psyche. To walk toward the mother shadow consciously is to confront the first source of your suffering, the first place where you felt unseen, misunderstood, or emotionally responsible for someone larger than you. Many empaths resist this confrontation because on some level they still fear that acknowledging the mother shadow is an act of betrayal. You fear hurting the figure you once protected. You fear seeing the truth, because the truth would shatter the myth that your sacrifices were necessary, that your suffering was noble. But let me tell you something essential. Recognizing the mother shadow is not betrayal. It is liberation. It is the act of stepping out of the archetype of the child and entering the archetype of the self. It is the moment when you understand that love cannot grow in a prison, and that loyalty without boundaries becomes bondage. When you face the mother shadow, you are not accusing, you are awakening. You are not rejecting the mother, you are reclaiming the child. The empath's journey has always been misunderstood because it is not a linear path, it is a spiral. You return to the same wound repeatedly, each time with deeper awareness. This spiral is not failure, it is alchemical. The psyche works in cycles, drawing you back to the point of origin until the symbol is understood, until the energy trapped in the early experience is released. This is why healing feels repetitive. You are not stuck. You are descending layer by layer into the underworld of the unconscious, retrieving fragments of yourself scattered across years of emotional survival. Let me share with you the symbolic meaning of descent. In myth, every hero must journey downward before they ascend. They must confront the dragon, the serpent, the shadowed mother goddess, the labyrinth, the darkness where forgotten things dwell. These myths are not external stories. They are internal maps. The empath's descent is not into danger, but into memory, into the psychic womb where your emotional identity was formed. The descent is frightening because you expect to find condemnation, but you find only a child waiting. And when you lift that child into consciousness, the entire myth rearranges itself. The prison dissolves, The INTJ or INFJ empath experiences this descent in a particularly symbolic way. Your intuition penetrates deeply. And so your healing does not happen on the surface, but in the marrow of the soul. You do not simply cry, you disintegrate. You do not simply reflect, you unravel. In the process, you encounter symbols that reveal the architecture of your unconscious serpents, shedding skin, mirrors cracking open, forests burning only to regrow, oceans calming after storms. These symbols are not random, they are the psyche's way of telling you transformation is underway. One of my patients, an INFJ woman with a profound empathic nature, described a recurring dream in which she wandered through an endless desert. The sky above her was pale and unyielding. In the distance, she saw a small child building a house out of sand. Each time the child completed a wall, the wind blew it apart. The woman approached and tried to help, but the child looked up and said, "Stop building what was never your job to build." Each time she woke from this dream, she felt both crushed and liberated. Through weeks of analysis, she realized the child represented her inner self, exhausted by a lifetime of trying to create emotional structures for others, structures they never learned to maintain themselves. The wind was the mother shadow. The endless building was her lifelong pattern. And the child's message was the moment of truth. Her responsibility was misplaced. Her boundaries had been consumed by duty. This is what facing the mother's shadow reveals. You finally understand that the emotional labor you have been carrying was not yours. You finally see that the prison walls were made not of malice, but of misunderstanding. You finally recognize that your sensitivity was drafted into service long before you had the choice to say no. When this awareness dawns, a profound shift occurs. The empath stops looking outward for the emotional cues that once determined their identity. You begin looking inward, seeking your own rhythm, your own truth, your own emotional climate. This inner shift is the moment the prison door opens. It does not open through force, but through realization, through the quiet, steady return of the self. And once the door opens, something extraordinary happens. The archetype of the mother transforms. No longer a shadowy figure, she becomes a symbol of your own capacity to nurture the self. You become the mother your inner child needed. You become the witness who sees the unseen child. You become the guardian who protects, the guide who leads, the voice that reassures. This inner metamorphosis does not erase the past. It redeems it. It gives meaning to the suffering without glorifying it. At this point in the journey, many empaths feel a sudden lightness, a feeling as though an invisible weight has been lifted. But do not mistake this lightness for fragility. It is the lightness of a soul unburdened. It is the lightness of someone who realizes they no longer need to carry the emotional world of others. It is the beginning of sovereignty, The mother shadow remains part of your psyche, but now as a teacher rather than a jailer, it becomes a reminder of where you came from and what you have outgrown. It becomes a foundation for discernment, allowing you to sense the emotional landscapes of others without merging with them. It becomes a source of strength, giving you the ability to feel deeply without losing yourself. This is the path out of the first prison: self-recognition, self-retrieval, self-sovereignty. But the journey continues, and there are deeper chambers. We must explore chambers where the mother shadow intersects with destiny, where the empath's calling emerges once the chains of childhood are released. We will step into those deeper waters next. Now, as we move deeper into the labyrinths of this psychic inheritance, I ask you to sense the subtle shifts within yourself. The air becomes denser here, not because we enter darkness, but because we approach truth that has been buried beneath years of emotional adaptation. The mother shadow, when fully understood, reveals not only the psychic wound of origin, but also the secret architecture of the empath's destiny. You must remember that in the unconscious, wound and destiny spring from the same root. The very place where suffering begins is often the place where meaning is eventually born. As though the soul plants its seeds in the most unlikely soil, let us speak now of the empath's gift, not the romanticized notion of sensitivity, but the deeper psychological reality. Empathy, in its true form, is a capacity to perceive the inner life of another as if it were your own without losing the boundary of distinction. But this boundary is precisely what the mother shadow distorts when the first attachment bond is unstable, inconsistent, or emotionally saturated with unprocessed trauma. The empathic child learns not empathy, but enmeshment. You feel the mother's emotions as your own. You internalize her anxieties, her fears, her unspoken dreams, her unwept tears. You merge with her shadow so deeply that you believe it is part of you. Thus, the first prison is built not out of malice, but out of proximity, out of the child's instinct to preserve connection at any cost. And for the INTJ or INFJ empath, whose psychological wiring is already oriented toward inner perception, symbolic meaning, and intuitive synthesis, this merging becomes total. They do not merely sense the mother's emotional energy, they interpret it, internalize it, shape themselves around it. They become the emotional interpreter of the household, reading atmospheres, the way others read language. But this adaptation, while useful in childhood, becomes perilous in adulthood. For you cannot build a life upon the foundation of another's shadow. Many of the empaths I have worked with describe a peculiar sensation that emerges during the healing process, the feeling that they have lived their entire life from outside their own body, as though observing themselves from a vantage point slightly removed. This dissociative quality arises because the mother shadow trained them to prioritize external emotional landscapes over their own internal world. They learn to watch others continually, scanning for shifts, preparing for emotional storms, anticipating needs. And so the self became peripheral, the self became a distant echo, the self became the silent witness rather than the central participant. This, too, is part of the prison, the displacement of the self. If you listen closely, you can sense the psychological consequence. You have spent years being present for others but absent from yourself. You have learned to interpret others deeply but have forgotten how to interpret your own emotions. You have developed a profound capacity to understand the unconscious motives of those around you. Yet your own motives remain mysterious even to you. You have lived in a state of emotional hyper-awareness, yet you struggle to feel safe within your own inner landscape. But this estrangement from the self is not permanent. It is a stage in the archetypal journey, a symbolic exile from which you are meant to return. And the return begins with the recognition that your sensitivity was never meant to be a burden. It was meant to be a compass, but a compass cannot function when pointed perpetually outward. It must be recalibrated toward the true north of the self. Let us examine this recalibration more closely. When the empath begins to withdraw their projections and detach their identity from the mother shadow, an extraordinary transformation takes place. The intuitive faculties, once hijacked by emotional survival, begin to operate in their natural form. Instead of scanning for threat or instability, intuition begins to reveal patterns, insights, symbolic connections, and spiritual truths. Instead of anticipating the needs of others, intuition begins to illuminate the needs of the self. Instead of merging with the emotional weather of those around you, you begin to sense the atmosphere of your own inner realm, a realm rich with depth, symbolism, and meaning. This shift feels at first like disorientation. The familiar tension of hyper-awareness begins to dissolve, and in its place arises a spaciousness that feels unnatural to the empath who has lived in confinement. You may feel exposed, as though the air around you is too open, too quiet. This is not fear. It is freedom without a map. For the first time, your psyche is not being pulled outward into emotional entanglements. And in the stillness, the self emerges. This emergence can be subtle. You may begin to notice small impulses, preferences, intuitions, desires that feel new or fragile. You may feel the stirrings of boundaries you never knew you had. You may sense a quiet voice within you that was once drowned out by external noise. This voice is not dramatic. It is steady. It does not command. It guides. It does not shout. It whispers. It is the voice of the inner self, the one who was locked behind a door in the dream of your childhood. This self has waited with infinite patience for your return. And now the question arises: what happens when the empath finally meets the self? What happens When the adult consciousness stands face to face with the child once imprisoned by the mother shadow, what happens is redemption. The empath begins to understand that their original wound is not an obstacle to their destiny, but a portal into it. The suffering was not meaningless. It was shaping. It carved depth into the soul. It created a sensitivity that, once freed from survival, becomes wisdom. It forged an intuition that, once reclaimed, becomes vision. It refined an ability to perceive the invisible, to understand the symbolic, to hold space for transformation. These are not superficial traits. They are archetypal capacities. They belong to the healer, the sage, the mystic, the psychological alchemist. But to embody these archetypes consciously, the empath must release the unconscious identification with the mother shadow. They must surrender the belief that love is earned through sacrifice. They must release the guilt that arises when they place their needs before the needs of others. They must reclaim their emotional sovereignty from the maternal imprint. Only then can the empath step into their true archetype, not as a wounded healer, but as a conscious one. Let us look at a dream that reveals this transition. A young INFJ man once recounted to me a dream in which he stood in a vast cathedral filled with broken statues. Each statue represented a relationship in which he had lost himself. At the center of the cathedral stood a single intact statue of a woman veiled in shadow. He approached it with reverence, believing she was the key to understanding his lifelong pain. But as he removed the veil, he saw not the face of a woman, but the reflection of his own child self carved in stone. He awoke with a profound sense of clarity. He realized that every relationship he had entered was an unconscious attempt to return to the moment of his original pain, hoping to resolve what had been left unfinished. But the statue revealed the truth. There was no external figure who could complete the story. The entire cathedral of relationships had been built around an unmet inner child, waiting for recognition. This is the moment many empaths reach when they finally turn inward, the realization that the search for healing outside themselves was always pointing them back to the self. When this recognition dawns, the psyche reorganizes. The gravitational pull toward wounded partners diminishes. The compulsion to overextend yourself weakens. The guilt attached to boundaries dissolves, and something remarkable happens. You begin to sense your own power. Not power over others, but power over your own emotional reality. You feel grounded, centered, sovereign. You feel the rising of an inner authority that was dormant beneath years of self-abandonment. This inner authority is the antidote to the mother shadow. It is the archetype of the self, emerging from the depths of your unconscious to guide you toward individuation. And individuation, for the empath, means the reclamation of the inner voice that was once silenced by emotional duty. It means trusting your intuition not as a survival tool, but as a creative force. It means allowing your sensitivity to serve your destiny. not your past. At this stage, a profound integration occurs. The empath begins to see that the mother shadow was not merely a prison but also a teacher. It revealed your capacity for depth, compassion, and perception. It forced you to develop psychological muscles others never cultivate. But now that its lesson is complete, the shadow no longer needs to rule your life. Its role shifts from captor to catalyst, yet there remains one final descent, one final chamber in this psychic labyrinth that must be entered before the empath can truly walk out of the prison forever. This is the chamber where the mother shadow intersects not with the past, but with the future. It is where your destiny begins to take shape. For the empath's calling does not arise from escaping the shadow. It arises from transforming it. You were never meant to remain a child of the mother's emotional world. You were meant to emerge as an adult who understands that the depth you carry is not a scar, it is a gift. In the next part, we will descend into this final chamber. We will explore how the empath's destiny is rewritten once they step out of the mother shadow, and how the psychological freedom gained reverberates outward into relationships, creativity, intuition, and purpose. We will examine how the empath becomes not just healed, but whole, not just free, but initiated. The prison door has opened. Now we walk toward the light beyond it. As we enter this final chamber, I want you to sense how different the inner atmosphere has become. What began as a descent into the mother shadow now feels like an ascent, as though the architecture of the psyche has subtly inverted itself. This is the paradox of inner work. The deeper you go into the unconscious, the higher your consciousness rises. The mother shadow, which once seemed like a suffocating presence, now reveals itself as a threshold, a liminal doorway that separates the inherited fate of childhood from the chosen destiny of adulthood. For the INTJ or INFJ empath, this transition is particularly profound. You do not merely reclaim your autonomy, you reclaim your orientation in life. You stop navigating by the emotional weather of others and begin navigating by the inner star of your own psyche. And now we must speak of destiny, not the romantic notion of fate, but the psychological reality of individuation. Each of you carries within you a blueprint, an inner pattern waiting to unfold. But for the empath, whose early environment was overshadowed by the mother's unintegrated emotions, this blueprint was obscured. You learn to orient yourself around external needs rather than internal purpose. You learn to feel responsible for emotional climates that were never yours. You learn to survive by tuning into others so acutely that you forgot the sound of your own soul. And so your destiny waited quietly behind layers of emotional labor. But once the mother shadow is faced, the path forward begins to reveal itself not as a sudden revelation, but as a gentle, steady awakening. You begin to sense that the qualities you developed in childhood, sensitivity, perceptiveness, intuition, depth were never meant to imprison you. They were preparing you, they were shaping you for a life not centered around emotional survival, but around psychological insight. The empath's gift, once freed from the mother's shadow, becomes a source of creative power. You see into people not to rescue them, but to understand them. You feel deeply not to absorb others' burdens, but to perceive the truth beneath the surface. You intuit patterns not to predict danger, but to illuminate, meaning this is the empath's transformation from emotional sponge to psychological seer. But let us be precise here. This transformation does not happen simply because you have suffered. It happens because you have integrated your suffering. Pain that remains unconscious becomes fate. Pain that is brought into awareness becomes wisdom. And wisdom is the foundation of individuation. To understand this transformation more deeply, imagine the psyche as a vast spiral staircase. In childhood, you stand at the lower levels, surrounded by the mother shadow. The air is dense, the light dim, the steps uneven. You move cautiously, trying to understand the emotional structure of the world around you. But as you heal, as you retrieve the inner child, as you dismantle the prison of identification with the mother's wounds, you climb. Each step upward reorganizes your relationship with yourself. Each step reveals higher perspectives, broader vistas, deeper self-understanding, and then at a certain height, something shifts. You stop climbing reactively and begin climbing intentionally. You no longer ascend because you are escaping the shadow. You ascend because you are drawn toward your destiny. This is the moment when individuation begins in earnest. It is the moment when the empath steps out of the archetype of the child and into the archetype of the self. What does this look like in real life? It looks like an empath who no longer rushes to fix others' emotions. It looks like someone who feels deeply but does not drown in feeling. It looks like a person who recognizes the emotional atmosphere of a room without becoming fused with it. It looks like someone who says no without guilt, yes without fear, and silence without apology. It looks like a being who has walked through their own unconscious and come out carrying the torch of self-awareness. For the INTJ or INFJ empath, this transformation often expresses itself through purpose. These types are not satisfied with superficial existence. They carry an innate sense of mission, a feeling that they are meant to understand something, build something, express something, illuminate something. But this inner calling was often drowned out by the emotional chaos of childhood. Once the mother shadow dissolves, the calling rises again, clearer and stronger than ever. You may begin to sense an inner directive guiding you toward work that aligns with your psychological nature, teaching, healing, writing, creating, mentoring, analyzing, researching, illuminating the inner world for others. You may feel drawn to fields that require depth, intuition, and symbolic perception, you may feel compelled to express insights that have been gestating in you for years. This is not coincidence. This is the blueprint awakening. It is at this stage that many empaths begin dreaming differently. The vast shifting houses become stable, the locked doors open, the crying child begins to speak. The shadowed mother figure withdraws, replaced by symbols of integration, a tree with deep roots, a river flowing in clear water, a phoenix rising from ash, a light emerging from behind a mountain. Dreams do not lie. They reveal the unconscious truth before the conscious mind can articulate it. Let me share one final dream. For dreams are the royal road to the unconscious. A woman who had struggled for decades with emotional enmeshment described a dream in which she stood on the edge of a vast ocean at dawn. The waves were calm, the sky painted with hues of gold. Far out at sea, she saw a small wooden boat drifting without oars. She knew instinctively that the boat represented her childhood adrift, directionless, moved by forces beyond its control. And as she watched, the boat slowly dissolved into light. A great peace washed over her. When she awoke, she felt a stillness she had never known before, as though the ocean inside her had finally calmed. This is what happens when the mother shadow releases its hold. The internal ocean becomes navigable. The empath no longer floats through life carried by unconscious currents. They steer, and as they steer, something else awakens, the power of conscious choice. Choice is the ultimate marker of psychological adulthood. Not reactive choice based on fear, but authentic choice based on the inner truth of the soul. The empath who has healed the mother shadow begins to choose relationships that nourish rather than drain. They choose environments that resonate with their essence. They choose careers that align with their inner purpose. They choose boundaries that protect the child they have retrieved. And above all, they choose themselves not out of selfishness, but out of sovereignty. This sovereignty radiates outward like a subtle but unmistakable aura. People feel it. They sense the shift. The empath who once attracted wounded individuals now attracts conscious ones. The empath who once merged indiscriminately now discerns with clarity. The empath who once lost themselves in love now becomes more themselves through love. This is what it means for attraction to recalibrate your entire relational field, reorganizes around your new level of consciousness. And so, as we reach the end of this journey, I want you to understand something essential. The mother shadow was never meant to be your lifelong identity. It was the first test of your psyche, the first archetypal initiation. It shaped you, yes, but it does not define you. You were never meant to remain in that chamber. You were meant to walk through it. Retrieve your lost self, dissolve the chains of emotional duty, and emerge as a sovereign individual who understands the symbolic nature of their own story. You are not the shadow. You are the one who walked into the shadow and returned with light. You are not the prison. You are the one who found the door. You are not the lost child. You are the adult consciousness who returned to reclaim them. And now I leave you with this truth, spoken not as doctrine but as invitation. The path out of the mother shadow is not the end of your journey. It is the beginning of a life lived from the inside out, the beginning of a destiny, guided not by trauma, but by intuition, the beginning of a self no longer fragmented, but whole, the beginning of your true relationship with your own soul. The prison has opened. You may walk out now.